Peace and blessings. This is Jay Carey, and I am on the chopping block at visceralchange.org.
Welcome back, everybody, to this episode of the Chopping Block. I am here today with, man, I can't even put into words, my mentor above many things, friend above that, brother above that, my man, Jay Carey. It's been years trying to get this man on the Chopping Block. He's a busy dude doing the good work, and I'm just grateful that he's taken a couple hours out of his day to kind of set up with me and chop it up with me. So before anything happens, Jay, what's going on, baby? How are you doing?
Peace, brother. We in the virtual building, man. We here. It's so good to see you, man. It's been a long time. Yes, I've been busy, man, as you have. And it's an honor for me to share space. I really do appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you, man. Every time I catch you at a distance or on social media, you're traveling the world, traveling the country, making things happen. So it's just good to see you and the beautiful family making it work even through this COVID time, man.
It's a gift, brother. It's a gift, and it's a gift to see you grow and blossom in the ways that you have as well, for sure. It's always great to see you. We out here all the way.
We out here, man. Folks listening, Jay Carey, man, is a licensed social worker. He's a psychotherapist, mental health clinician, and in his own private practice. He also works at Salem State University, our alma mater, dare I say, as a mental health clinician and multicultural specialist. That's right. So Jay is constantly doing the work, and I'm really excited today, man, to talk about mental health, talk about the elements of psychology, talk about therapy, and really the Black community with sort of a Black male focus, man. So I think a lot of people need to hear it. I know the listeners need to hear it. I know there's a lot of discussion that is not had that I'm hoping maybe your expertise and years of experience to kind of fill in some of those gaps for us as we tackle it, man.
I'm ready to
so let's jump right in.
Yeah,
let's do it, baby.
Do it.
Before we even get to the content, man.
Sure.
Born and raised in Albany, Jay?
Born and raised in Albany, New York. The
Albany,
518.
New York, man. The 518, man. Talk to us a little bit about young Jay Carey. A couple of things. Talk to us about your time in Albany, but I also want you to specifically highlight what it was like growing up as a biracial, light-skinned, young Black kid in that time, in that environment.
Wow. Yeah, where to start? So Albany is an interesting place in the sense of, I believe that it's roughly, I'd say almost 30%, Black culture, Black people. And I think almost 50% white folks who identify as white, and then there's another aggregate of kind of other cultures, other races, if you will. Mm-hmm. It's a challenging space. I mean, it's interesting in that Albany, I believe, has, or at least had, at least in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, like almost like a race wealth gradient to some degree, right? And so like certain communities, you're going to see certain types of people. And oftentimes certain resources are attributed to those communities, which is quite different than other communities. So, where I lived, I started off in much more of a kind of an urban community, so to speak, densely populated, very high crime rate. There was a lot of violence, a lot of drugs. Again, I grew up in the 80s and 90s in upstate New York. It's about an hour away from the city. So we got it popping up there for sure. For sure. And so I was born in 79, came up through the 80s, a lot of challenges. I would dare to say that one of my kind of primary, kind of growth points or difficulties, I guess I could say, was struggling with some domestic violence. So, my mother, white woman from Slingerlands, which is a suburb in New York outside of Albany, very homogenous, very affluent community. Mom's very gracious. She's a middle child, so she had a little rebel in her, a little radical in her. My mother also has lots and lots of soul. And so she, always I'm waking up to Ray Charles and Dobie Gray and Marvin Gaye. Stevie Wonder every single day for 15 years. And my mother has a lot of rhythm. She has a lot of soul, very kind woman. Unfortunately, my biological father struggled with his own addiction, struggled with his own past, had a lot of his own traumatic history that then shaped us through the lens of some domestic violence related stuff. There reached a point when I was very, very young where my mother basically had to take my sister and I and whatever she could carry and just kind of start a new life. And so we became what I would identify as relatively transient, and not feeling like we had roots in any specific location, kind of bouncing around a little bit. I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house, who was also kind of a pillar, if you will. But, you talked about, the biracial identity, marginalized identity, very much feeling stuck in the middle. My brother, Austin Ash, referenced this idea of dual citizenship when I was listening to Chopping Block. Shout out to
Austin.
Yes. Referencing this idea of dual citizenship, which to me really was a very salient point for me in my upbringing as well. Feeling connected to different groups and aggregates of people based on my levels of safety, levels of exposure. For example, elementary school, predominantly white school, I would say at least over 90%, if not more, one or two Black or brown folks per class. And I learned very quickly in that space to associate, social capital. And this not saying this is healthy, because it's not. As a kid, sometimes we experience things. My perspective was that there was some type of power connected to whiteness, right? In the sense of access to resources, in the sense of, when I got in trouble, there were some things that would go down. And sometimes my white counterparts or white classmates weren't necessarily kind of subject to that same degree of punishment. For example, I had a teacher who was a very nice woman, to do, well-intended, I'm sure, I hope. When I would get in trouble in the class, she would say, step into my office, take me out to the hallway, and she would ask me to wash the walls, right? And so, mind you, one of maybe two African-American kids in the class. I don't remember any white kids washing walls. Those types of things sent me messages to presume that there might have been something associated with,
of course,
kind of how I looked and the ways in which I was treated. Middle school, very different, predominantly Black school, public school, lot of violence. We, fighting every day. We had this thing in middle school called floor wars. And if your homeroom was on the second floor, for example, but you had a class on the third floor, when you went up to 3, you got to watch your back, because you might get some hands and some feet. And so people used to literally run to class back in the day. Shut up. It was wild. It was a wild, wild time. In truth, high school was more so, it was a bit more neutral, not necessarily as violent. Also noticing a racial disparity, in truth. Lot of violence in certain circles, in certain pockets. And it was interesting. When I was very young, being biracial, you feel marginalized, you feel kind of stuck. And you might go through certain periods where you might identify with one side or the other a bit more on occasion. When I was very young, because, my mother was associated to a place of safety, this is just by chance. There's no tact or significance to this at all. In fact, it's sad for me to say, but I was getting my nurturing and my caretaking came from my mother, who was white, and my biological father was a Black man, large Black man, dark-skinned Black man, and also was responsible for a lot of violence, a lot of danger. And every time he came around, it was a problem. And so in my psyche, especially I didn't grow up around my father at all. And so I forgot what he looked like. And so every time I would see a large Black man when I was a young kid, I was afraid that it was him, and I was afraid that he was going to hurt us.
That connection. Right.
Powerful and very sad.
Crazy.
But meaningful stuff. And so when I was in elementary school, I associated myself to trying to feel like I could identify with whiteness, although I could never pass. I could still feel like the more I could affiliate with a sense of whiteness, the safer I would be. just because of the exposure and experience I was having. Whereas in middle school, it was completely opposite.
Sure.
I identified then with social capital and blackness because I felt safer because not only was it predominantly black, but if you could identify with that level of blackness, I got away with things more so because I was black amongst the students.
Almost like there was a book Charlemagne came out with a couple of years back called Black Privilege. And it almost sounds like it's grounded in that narrative where it's where black identity in this context may be the majority, chances are that identity also has the privilege.
And there is a context, and there's lots of limitations on that context.
Yep.
But it happens. And so again, because, the students, middle school, a lot of fights, students have a lot of power. There's a lot of places where there aren't teachers or staff. And, I had white friends that were getting beat up just because they had the same shirt as somebody else. I had white friends that were getting beat up often just because they were white, not knowing that systemically, outside of the school, there was actually a lot of privilege connected to their experience that they weren't necessarily aware of. And also not knowing and understanding that oftentimes, the under-resourced and the underrepresentation and the lack of privilege and power amongst the black students created that like a trauma response, created a reaction, right? Like this is all systemic. I mean, you know better than I do. So by the time I got to high school, things neutralized a bit, but the focus at that point was more on like manhood, and then ideas and concepts of like toxic masculinity came in. And identifying sexual attraction to other people, and that sort of thing became prominent. And then when I got to college, and this will be kind of the end of the story, unless you want me to expand on anything. When I got to college, I went to a couple of different schools. I went to a community college in upstate New York, and then I went to school very briefly in Florida. And then I ultimately ended up coming to Salem State, right, our alma mater. And when I did that, the first day I showed up, I walked into my uncle's house in Marblehead. My uncle is like one of the few black men that lives in Marblehead, very affluent community, top 2% of the country. I showed up that day and I walked in. He left the door unlocked because in Marblehead, everybody leaves the doors unlocked. And I opened up a newspaper. He left a newspaper on the dining room table, and I opened up the newspaper and I'm reading the newspaper. And then all of a sudden, literally probably a minute and a half later, the front door flies open. Cop comes in, police officer comes in, guns drawn, and the guns pointed at my head, guns pointed at my chest. Right? And he's yelling, who are you? What's your name? And I was like, Jay Carey. And he was like, what is your name? And I was like, Jay Carey. And he yelled that 4 or 5 times. And I noticed, number one, my own anxiety levels going through the roof.
Of course.
Rap for me. Back door flies open. Police gun drawn from the back. So now they got both doors open. This is my first day in Massachusetts. Now, mind you, young kid. I was just turned 20. I had a long silver chain and tattoos and, a tank top and had a do-rag on. I definitely was not from Marblehead.
Sure.
But that was my introduction to Massachusetts. I almost turned around.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Who wouldn't? And what brought you to Mass?
School.
School. Okay. Salem.
I was ready to honestly kind of like, so when I left Massachusetts, when I left upstate New York, just a lot of difficulty. I was socialized in a place of conflict and confrontation and some degree of violence. And I was trying to hopefully escape some of that. At that point, I had a young child. My daughter Jada was a year old when I moved out. So I had a child at 18. At this point, she was almost 2 years old, and I moved to Massachusetts to try to create a space to break the cycle of inadequate fatherhood by having to leave so that I can go and acquire the tools so that by the time she was old enough, she would realize I was not the stereotypical dad that was just kind of like out of the loop. So
that's it. Man, that go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's in a nutshell, that was the kind of the essence of the experience. A lot of conflict, had some great times and great moments. And oftentimes, as you know, sometimes the trauma and the darkness can overshadow some of the good stuff.
No doubt.
So I
No
don't
doubt.
mean to do that. I had some love for sure. My mother was very loving. My stepfather was very loving. My stepfather was around my entire life since I was in diapers. And so I attribute as my real father.
Indeed.
And he has an interesting story too, because he's one of 10 kids. He was born in Brooklyn, but raised in downtown Albany, which is almost all black. And he's a white guy.
Mm-hmm.
Also had a duty to protect in his family, grew up, went into the service. He was an Army guy.
Yep.
And there were moments in terms of race where, cars driving by, I'm taking a tennis ball out of the street, white guy drives by and, yells out the N-word. And, my father, my stepfather, who was my father, would get so infuriated that I remember him chasing cars through red lights. Because he would get so upset that he was willing to literally die to protect me and my sister, or my sister
That's
and I.
it.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, so
it's amazing how, and not that this wouldn't be the case for your dad, but it's amazing how it's amazing the level to which we are willing to advocate for an identity that we don't own when we have a direct relationship to it. You know what I mean? In this case, father-son really changes the dynamic and the extent to which I'm willing to put it on the line for you.
Mm-hmm.
And, the story you shared, man, powerful, because there's so many other young black boys who have experienced it or are experiencing it now. And one thing that really sticks with me that I hope folks leave with, in addition to everything else you said, is that you got to a place where you were able to take it upon yourself to acknowledge your circumstance and then have the foresight to see where that could take you negatively. Right. And that you made the call to say, let me get out of here to, as you said, break the cycle. Yes, your daughter's in the scene. That's a huge impetus to have her see that I'm not the stereotypical black dad that people have seen and maybe that you have experienced in your own right. But to know that if positioned appropriately, or if even taking a second to reflect, you can make that call now. If you're dealing with some of these challenges. So any of my young black and brown boys listening, know that the space is still there for you.
Absolutely.
So Jay, man, you found yourself in Massachusetts at Salem State. Now you mentioned some of the glory, which I know all too well. And I'm hoping the listeners will come to learn as we engage today. One thing about you is you have a bachelor's in criminal justice administration.
That's right.
And you also got 2 master's degrees, one of which in education, one in social work. Now, those are 3 very different disciplines. Now, switching your discipline from your bachelor's to your master's, I did the same thing. Most people tend to do that. Mm-hmm. But then you switched again, and although there's overlap, as we know, in education and social work, they are different disciplines. So you switched again to social work. Take us back to that time, man, and share with us where you were mentally, if it's appropriate, but I'm interested in knowing what you were thinking as far as careers went as you were trying to figure out what it meant to pick a major, to identify your degree, and then set yourself up moving forward from there.
That's right. So what we're doing now, just to clarify, is we're going from working in higher ed into getting a social work degree.
Yes, I'm hoping that you'll be able to share your thought process on, let me get this criminal justice degree, and then years later, well, actually, let me do higher ed, and then, well, actually, let me do social work. Just kind of that journey and what you were thinking.
So that's a fantastic question, and the reason why I say that is because when you reference criminal justice, education, and social work are quite different fields, at least in terms of the direction.
Sure. That's right.
They all could be identified as technically like human services, so to speak.
Correct.
In one field, we may look at, our kind of quote unquote customer as, an offender or a client or a defendant.
Yeah.
Right. You take that same person and through the lens of education, now that can be, student, so to speak. Right.
Right.
You take that same person and shift the lens to social work, and now you're looking at client. And so it's an interesting, kind of series of backgrounds that all can be working with the exact same person, just from different dimensions.
Yes.
Initially, when I decided on criminal justice, to be completely honest, I started school at 18 in community college. Around that time, I also met my biological father. I reconnected with him after probably, 17 years since I've seen him prior, with maybe some very brief exceptions that were like less than 30 minutes at a time. And I decided to choose criminal justice for two reasons. Number one, I did not want to find myself in the same cycles that I knew around my biological father. In and out of prison, struggled with some serious addiction, including, cocaine, crack, sales, and use. And so I did not want to fall into that cycle. And I learned relatively early on that oftentimes, as much as we try not to, sometimes we end up kind of gravitating or almost kind of repeating some cycles from our parents.
Yes.
So that was one reason. The other reason was because I just had a young child, I did not want to kind of, again, repeat those cycles. And so I was like, I need to do something. And I wanted to learn how to stay out of jail, to be completely honest.
Right.
So many of the men around me, my older brothers, just from kind of experience and, uncles and even parents were so caught up in that cycle of criminality and or incarceration that I was looking to break that cycle. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to pick criminal justice, and not for nothing. Aside from that, I don't have a skill set. I don't have an interest or a passion in so many other areas, to be honest. Like, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a, tech buff. I'm not a mathematician. I don't love business. I can hustle, but I don't I don't love it.
That's right.
Criminal justice felt like something I could gravitate towards because it gave me a chance to uproot a cycle, and it gave me a chance to inform myself to avoid certain things where I think, plagued a lot of the young people that looked and had experiences like I did. So chose criminal justice. At first I got an associate's, then I transferred to Salem, got a bachelor's degree in criminal justice administration, which is kind of more leadership related stuff. As I was doing that, I was also involved to some degree as a student leader. And so part of that was me meeting with a number of different folks in the law enforcement kind of area. And as I did that, in truth, I realized that may not necessarily be the best use of my skill set. And they all kind of encouraged me to continue to go on and get a master's degree. They said, Jay, look, if you go and get a master's, you're going to get this much % more on your salary. And not for nothing, being young and brown, it's a way. It's a way that you can really slide in smooth.
That's right.
So I then, I had to get a degree in either criminal justice, education, or social work. And so I chose criminal justice I chose education at that point because, number one, as soon as I graduated with the degree in criminal justice, I was offered a job opportunity. And I didn't really want to leave the campus because Salem State really did nurture and cultivate my success in really powerful, beautiful ways. I gotta say,
doesn't it do that, yo?
A lot of love. And so I was offered an opportunity. I took the opportunity. Now I'm working in higher ed. The degree in higher ed made a lot of sense. Also because one of my mentors, Dr. Lee Bressois,
Shout out to Lee. He founded and wrote the curriculum for this master's program. And he called me into his office personally and was like, Jay, I'm writing this curriculum. It's going through its kind of approval process now. My hope is to launch it soon. You should think about it. And so it was just kind of a natural progression. That's right.
So I pursued the degree in higher ed, got that in a couple of years, graduated in 2006. Now, the more interesting part comes as I started to emerge as a higher education professional. I found that the essence of my work, what I loved the most and what gave me the most amount of purpose, was working with students that I could help them break through issues outside of the classroom. And that, in essence, was directly connected to their mental health. Right. Like I had students that would come in and they were dealing with bad breakups or old domestic violence issues themselves, or they were struggling with substance use, or they've never been socialized around how to do school. Right. Like they didn't know how to study. They didn't understand, how to structure themselves and have these kind of administrative tools, keeping that academic integrity. And I love that. And then once I was able to really cultivate that space for them, and then receiving some love and getting flowers back metaphorically from those students, I was like, wow, I love to help these students break through. Sometimes even more than I like to help complete their application. So I was in admissions. For the last 8 years of my career, I was in admissions, graduate admissions specifically. And so ironically, I'm big on listening to the universe. And ironically, I was recruiting for social work programs, psychology master's programs, nursing programs, education programs, all these programs. And it gave me a firsthand view on what exactly I wanted to do next.
Yes.
Like, you know what? I love the purpose. I love to connect with people. I love the idea of helping people break through and reach the kind of step into their greatness, right? And and come and love them into being, if I could quote Mr. Rogers of all people, right? So, because I love that so much, I also had a friend who was also biracial. He was also a HESA grad, who was struggling with very intense mental health and ended up, kind of taking his own, right? That was in 2009. And that also helped me kind of as a springboard, and it sparked my thought to say, I want to be part of the solution on a deeper level. I wanted to focus specifically on mental health related issues, and social work at the master's level seemed to be the most versatile way to do that. And, and a licensed independent clinical social worker gets quite a bit of respect in the industry because of the versatility. And I can still do therapy. So I'm in my practice now. I have a private practice, and I'm working at Salem State, and now I'm teaching one class in social work. And it's been lovely. It's been lovely.
Teaching a class.
Teaching one class in the school of social work. Yeah, it's just one. And it's a field placement class, so it's very low hanging fruit. It's easy.
We'll take it. Yeah, we'll take it. I mean, that's another opportunity for the world to hear Jay Carey.
I mean,
and for you to kind of pass that message. That's incredible, man. And myself, and back in season 2, I asked Damian D-Lane, shout out to D-Lane, something very similar. Coming from operations into res ed into multicultural affairs. And my bachelor's degree is I had 2, one in American studies, one in juvenile justice. I always wanted to get into the law world. And then I went to a different school. They didn't have a law, major. So I'm like, well, I'll do journalism and history. And I didn't know what I was doing, man. I was playing hoop. That was really the main focus. But, and then
main focus, thing that still got 2 bachelors.
right. Yeah. But, I squeezed them out, fam. I don't want to pretend like it was in the cards for me. I squeezed them out. I graduated high school with a 2.1 GPA. I was at the bottom of the barrel.
Yep.
And then I was on academic probation when I was in undergrad just to be a student employee. So by the time I got to you at Salem State, gosh, almost 10 years ago at this point, man, by the time I got to you, it was like, I'm going to do this one for me. Like, this one's for me. Like, I know what I'm capable of, and I'm not about to be a stat in this way either. And that's when, we'll get to that in a second, when Mr. Jay Carey changed my entire life. We'll talk on that in a little bit. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you're teaching a class at Salem State, and you mentioned earlier that you also work there as well.
Yeah.
That experience you mentioned in admissions from years ago, does that at all inform the ways in which you work with the students today? Do you have a sense of understanding because you had a chance to work as a professional in higher ed? And how does that assist in your work at Salem State today? Great point.
Great question. So my first thought related to admissions specifically, because I worked in other spaces as well, but and I referenced admissions, so thank you for that, because I was there the longest. My work in admissions specifically helped me to inform myself around the idea of like vocational counseling. So when someone's coming to me and higher ed, for example, is on their radar or it's a goal for them, it then becomes a very easy transition because I'm familiar with the programs. I'm familiar with the admissions process. I'm familiar with the timelines and deadlines. I'm familiar with what they're looking for. I'm familiar with the value of a personal statement, for example. I'm familiar with the impact that undergraduate grade point averages have on determining a candidate's, one's candidacy at the graduate level. So through a lens of the kind of vocational counseling, I'm able to help people prepare for their next step if education is that. So that's real. There was a number of other things that I learned kind of indirectly from working in higher ed, including kind of through that, if I'm putting back on this kind of this lens of my own racial experience, the importance of representation of people in power and how important it is to see people in executive level positions as a student, and even as a professional.
Right.
Critically important for me to be able to look up to the people that were on, kind of with me that may have come before me, particularly those with Black and brown complexion, because it allowed me the possibility and it gave me the hope to believe that I could do it too.
Yes.
And so that was absolutely critical. And now if I loop that back to the work that I'm doing with clients, there is something that happens with all things education that I worked with students from high school all the way up into graduate school, because right now even I have students in high school that I'm working with through mental health counseling up into grad school. And in all cases, I continue to come back to the idea and the reality that there is a truth that exists even outside of the classroom in terms of the benefit and the value of what we get from higher ed. Now, education in general, if I was to kind of indirectly quote Malcolm X, right, it can cure the cancer of racism and a number of other isms. Education can set us free in different ways, of course, because of exposure and information and understanding. Now, I often tell, particularly my younger students, that what we learn from school, even more so sometimes than subject matter, is a degree of discipline that we would not be introduced to without it. And if someone can motivate themselves enough to sharpen tools and skills towards something they're not necessarily even interested in or passionate about, beginning in high school, what then happens when they take those same tools and apply it towards something that they love? Right. They become unstoppable. Unstoppable. When I was working with so many young students that were like, look, I hate school. They were brilliant kids, brilliant young people. I hate school. I'm not rocking with school. They're just trying to train me. They're trying to brainwash me. They're putting these limitations on. And I get that. I honor that. I appreciate that. And socializing oneself toward doing something every day, because we are what we do over time. Right. This degree of delayed gratification is, now we're getting a little bit into kind of more psychological stuff, but like delayed gratification has an extreme amount of value that instant gratification just can't provide. Yes. Right? So many of us can be great for a week. Right. But can we, to your point, can we take 10 years to finish something and end up finishing 2 somethings while being, recognized on state and national levels playing basketball? Right. So like, I mean, I'm just putting it into some practical terms. We can do things in a day. We all can have good days, but can we have a good month? Can we have good years? Not to say there won't be bumps and bruises along the way. Of course. Can we fall down 7 times and get up 8? And school, if nothing else, teaches us that discipline, sometimes that our home life might not teach us. That's right. Particularly a lot of these kids with working parents, and if the parents are out of the house, all love and praise and respect due to the parents that are doing the absolute best that they can. And sometimes young people aren't necessarily introduced to that level of discipline, but school can do that. No. Yeah. Yeah. And, that it's powerful because you talked about representation earlier. And I remember when I went to Wheelock College this side now. Yeah. And one thing they were known for, among a few other things, very, very, very small school. We're talking, when I first got there, 600 students, period, or something in that ballpark. It's since been purchased by Boston University down here now. One thing about Wheelock is that they had the most faculty of color in New England. And it was very clear. And it was clear within the academics. I remember taking social studies, or the equivalent, a history class with Dr. Joyce Hope Scott. And, it wasn't a standard history class that we took back in the day. It was, you had to look at Malcolm X, you mentioned, Dr. King, Sojourner Truth, Nikki Giovanni. I mean, we weren't looking at traditional whitened history. And this was the history class. And so you talked about having folks in positions of power. I'm a firm believer that very much reflects the behaviors we see next, from a systemic perspective as a system-centered researcher. One thing we learn is that behavior is very much a product of its design.
And so if there is a design in place that allows a behavior to exist, that behavior is going to exist.
Thank you.
If there is a different kind of design in place, a different behavior shows up. A quick example is, capitalism can work in a democracy because that design supports that behavior, right? But capitalism can't work in a dictatorship. That design doesn't support that behavior. And so you talk about the kids coming to you, I hate school this, school that. Is it school or is it the structure of it, the design?
Yes.
You're coming from a troubled space. Are you troubled, or was the environment one in which that troubled you?
Exactly.
And how can I take you into this space? Let's talk a little bit more about this representation and the work, right? And as you switched into it. Now, I'm sure you know these numbers, but I'm going to let them fly anyway.
Okay, please.
So we know that the United States is about 13% Black, generally, 13.4. Maybe on its best year, 14%, but 13% Black in general.
Yep.
And the psychology workforce, which is where you operate, as it's aptly titled, right? The APA produced a study recently, as recent as 2020, that found that the percentage of Black therapists sits around 4.24%. Percentage of Black therapists in the U.S., about 4.24%, or just 4% in general.
Yep.
Compared to the 84% white therapists that we see in the country. Now here's the kicker. Of that 4.24%, over three-fourths of them are Black women, which means Black men represent less than 25% of 4%. So I want to be clear here. Right. Not of 100. Of 4%, Black male therapists represent less than 25%. Jay, talk to us, man. What does that statistic say to you? And you talked about informing your work. How, if at all, does that inform your work? Is that representative of the clients you see, of the need for it in the community? Talk to me about those numbers and what that means to you.
So, wow, I'm blown away even to hear that again. And I think somewhere I might have heard it, but to hear it, every time I hear that, it's a shock to me.
Wild.
And it shouldn't be, in truth, because I have eyes, and when they're open, I can see that myself. So one of the first things it tells me is it speaks to the need for men of color to enter this field, because there is a need would be an understatement. It would be a stark understatement. It also speaks to, like you referenced, around how, one's circumstances emerge from the design that's in place. And so I wonder if, part of that demographic is reflective of a design that is not necessarily flawed, but very much designed in favor of certain demographics.
Skewed in a direction.
Exactly. I worked when I first started as a full-time therapist in 2017, I entered Lynn Community Health Center. Very diverse, very, very diverse. It was very much a melting pot in the sense. And Lynn Community Health Center, being that it was based in the community, it was on Union Street. So it was in the middle of the valley. It was where people are. And I would still dare to say that, to your point, over 70, if not over 80%, were white women as therapists, which I think is amazing to have any support in that sense. And reflective identity very much matters. And so I then became valued, not because I was good, but because of my demographic, because people were looking for a male therapist and a Black or brown male therapist.
That's right. That
alone makes business very, very good for me. And I'm not proud of it. And so there's always the line, there's always a list, there's always people who are reaching out to seek male therapists, particularly for oftentimes for young male clients, most often, but also I was connected to the diversion program. There was a juvenile diversion program in Lynn where in order for young students, particularly male students, to avoid a criminal charge if they did something small, let's say they stole a bike, they would then, rather than get arrested and get kind of pulled into the system, they would get referred to a number of supports in the community, me being one of those supports. And then I would meet with them, however long I would need to. And then soon after that, I could give them a letter, and then they can go and advocate in court, and then we could discontinue. in almost all of those cases, every single one of the people that I was referred to from the diversion program are still on my caseload today. And it spoke to the need, right? Like in reality, this was mandatory. They had to come to therapy.
Right.
Years after their case was completely closed, they are still here. And because it was important. And so it also speaks to, criminality, or how some of these young people are ended up catching charges because, like you said, if the design is flawed, the byproduct of that design is going to show.
Yes.
And in fact, when people in general have opportunities to heal, and we can unpack that too, like why, oftentimes in BIPOC communities, we find that, there's a stigma related to mental health.
That's actually one of my next questions. So take us right there. Go right for it.
Okay. So when it comes to that stigma, oftentimes young people in particular are more, the design pushes them more toward criminality in some cases because of a lack of resources, because of an opportunity to get a job or to be kind of exposed to, a resourced type of funding stream. They're oftentimes kind of guided more in the direction of criminality than they might be toward healing, and then identifying tools and skills that they can acquire because innately they already have them there. They just need somebody to point at them and say, no, it's right there. We got to practice this. We do a little bit of that. And yes, you are, and back to loving them into being. Take the mask off of the imposter syndrome. How do we uproot that? So when we talk about stigma, culturally speaking, we know that oftentimes seeking mental health support is associated with frailty. Yes. When in truth, especially nowadays, is more and more becoming, a reality that seeking mental health support is a sign of courage, and we're trying to make that transition.
That's right.
But if we go back to earlier kind of cultural histories where families who had someone who had a clear and evident mental health issue, those families were then kind of like shunned or just misidentified, or they were kind of not excommunicated, but for lack of a better term, at times, if one had a clear and present mental health issue because of the stereotype, their social status was kind of like demoted in a sense.
Sure. Yeah.
Wild. And we also know there's a number of historical stigmas around treatment, when we think of things like, the Tuskegee experiment, right?
Yes.
Mental health have a very, very strong bridge. And so it's critically important for us to identify with how historically treatment oftentimes became something that was unsafe.
Yeah.
We bring it now into the present day, and like currently, although I feel like, number one, mental health is now a premier industry. If it wasn't before the pandemic, it absolutely is now. I heard something on a podcast recently that said, and this is anecdotal, so I don't know, but they said something around 2.8 more million people sought therapy from 2020 into 2021. And I'm presuming that this year is going to be even larger. In my office in particular, at Salem State, last year, we've doubled the numbers that we had from this time last year. Something else that's interesting through the lens of kind of race is we have had an influx of Black and brown students in our office.
Sure. Wow.
Almost tipping the scales. Like they're almost predominant, which my hope, and that to me, that does not speak to the need necessarily, even though I guess it kind of does as I'm thinking about it. I hope that it speaks to the normalizing of treatment.
Sure.
Because there's been a lot of that recently. From podcast presentations to, different athletes and celebrities, people of different social statuses announcing how important it is. And so it seems like Black and brown communities are now given permission to start to seek therapy, which is wonderful to see. Please forgive me.
And no. And so what is therapy? What is mental health assistance? Is it for folks listening, for folks trying to figure it out, and just as a general point of conversation?
Yeah.
Let me back up. Let me try to find a way to frame it. A piece of what I gleaned from what you said and the information you provided was much like visiting a dentist. We tend to wait until the problem shows up, and then we're like, oh, this is actually important. Right? And as we think about mental health, oftentimes we wait until something happens, like the pandemic. Then we're like, oh, wait, we should probably take this seriously. This isn't random. This has always been here.
Right.
Understanding that, when I ask what is mental health assistance, what is therapy, I'm not quite sure how to troubleshoot my computer and I'm upset about it. I need therapy. Or is it always something deeper? I mean, give me your thoughts, Jay, on is there ever a time where someone says, no, you don't need therapy for that, and that's actually relevant, or is it very subjective? It's a loaded question. I apologize, but you see where I'm going, I think.
Powerful, absolutely powerful question. Complicated response. Here, I'll do the best I can. Here we go. So the first thing is, I mean, the response is all the above. Many people come into therapy for many different reasons. Sometimes they come in to assess whether or not they even need therapy.
Okay.
Right? I want to assess, the degree to which I even have trauma. I hear about this trauma all the time. People are talking about trauma. Do I, in fact, have trauma? Is that, in fact, affecting me? And how severe is that impact on my day-to-day functioning?
Got it. Okay.
Some people come in because they know they have clear and present issues they need to work through. They might have had a recent or a past traumatic experience, or they might be actively struggling with a substance use problem. Or they could, in fact, be noticing that their anxiety is starting to limit their day-to-day kind of functioning. Or they have noticed that there's a number of symptoms that might or might not fit under kind of a depressive diagnosis, and they want to assess how real it is and what that looks like. So oftentimes people come in to be assessed. Some people come in with more of a clear picture. And then sometimes people come in without problems, but there's this degree of like positive psychology where it's less about bringing someone from, metaphorically speaking, numerically speaking, a negative 10 to a 0, but it's more about bringing someone that's at like a 2 or 3 and bringing them up to a positive 10.
Gotcha.
10 being perfect. So,
gotcha.
So many people enter the world of therapy for very different reasons. In my opinion, it's all really valuable. And yes, there are cases where I'll meet with someone and they want to see what's going on and whether or not they have tools to address it. And I'll say, if this feels like a helpful space and they want to continue, fine. But in reality, I tell them that, look, the reality is, back to your metaphor around the teeth, like the preventative is good. You come in, we do a review, we take a 30,000 foot view of everything that's going on. I tend to break things up into different domains or different buckets, how's the inner narrative, in terms of behavior, thoughts, feelings, behavior, family, academic. And so we kind of break these things up into categories and we rate each category. So we'll scale them. And based on that, we then give them a determination. Now, to your question around what therapy is, I think that the easiest way to frame it would be there is an analogy from a person whose name kind of slips my mind right now, and I'm going to find it, even try to maybe look it up while we're having this conversation. But a map, a compass, and a candle. And I love it. And in fact, the analogy wasn't even for therapy, but I think it fits therapy beautifully. So this is not mine. The map essentially allows us to understand history. It gives us a blueprint. It allows us to look at our experience, see where we've come, where we are now, and where we'd like to go. Right. So let's say we want to go into a mall and we're trying to get to Filene's basement. Okay. All right. We get to we walk into the mall, we look at that map, we see the "You are here" sign, all right? We look at the parking lot, okay, we came from this parking lot, okay, that's the history. We look at where we've already been, what we've done, how that went. We look at the "You are here," and the "You are here" is, okay, this is where we are, so we understand our frame of reference in relation to the larger picture.
Right.
And then we want to get to Filene's basement, so we have to go up to Macy's and take a right, right? So now we have an idea of where we've come, where we are now, and where we're going. So the map is critical. That's one of the first things that I do in addition to developing rapport, right?
Love that.
I like to
Love that.
A safe space, create a comfortable space. I allow people to understand that I really do feel honored that someone standing in front of me bearing witness to their story is the most powerful thing I could ever experience. So in addition to, and we'll get to that too in a minute. So the map is just kind of understanding the blueprint and painting a picture, because I believe very, very firmly with literally every person I've ever worked with, if I can understand enough of their picture, then people start to make sense. And it's not that people have a picture unpainted, but in fact, oftentimes there may be a light focused on one side of the picture. And then, this part of the picture is still there, it's still present, but there's no light on that side. And because I'm also a very firm believer that people have the tools that they need inside of them. They just need someone to hold up the mirror. Right. So my job is to hold up that mirror and allow them to see the most beautiful parts of themselves.
Yes.
So that's the map. Now the compass is where I come in most prominently. The compass is the interventions. The compass is me using my kind of my therapy models and different tools and skills that I've acquired along the way that I think would be most helpful for the person that I'm working with.
That's it.
And so that's when we get into cognitive behavioral therapy. We get into internal family systems. We get into narrative therapy. We get into what's called EMDR. We do trauma work, body-based work.
Yep.
And that is all the interventions, the things that happen, the things that I'm able to use my tools. That's the compass part. And then lastly is the candle, right? Map, compass, and candle. The candle is the love. The candle is positive reinforcement. The candle is them knowing when they step into a space with Jay Carey or any therapist, hopefully, they are going to feel valued. They're going to feel seen. They're going to feel heard. And the focus is on them, right? That's one of the differences between a conversation with a really good friend and therapy. Therapy is if someone walks into my space, it's them. The focus is on them.
Right.
Mind you, I'll bring myself into it in relation to how it can be helpful for them, but it gives them an opportunity to unpack their experience, and they don't have to feel guilty about talking about them for that full hour.
That's
so the map, compass, and candle is a great way to frame it.
Love that.
And it really works because once we understand where we're going, and then along the way, we practice all these different tools to see what's going to work for them. And then also there's always this unconditional positive regard that's happening in every single session. And I mean, there's a model of therapy that's more relational. It's called humanistic by Dr. Carl Rogers. And he speaks specifically about the nature of the relationship itself is healing. So if someone comes into my space and I'm able to just focus on the nature of our relationship, and I can build them up and empower them and give them confidence and challenge that imposter syndrome that comes up with so many of my BIPOC clients, then we can get somewhere really, really far, even if it's unrelated to what happened to them.
I love that.
Like, I was listening to this podcast called Code Switch, and the topic was, can therapy heal racism? Now, I mean, the short answer to that is no, right?
Interesting.
We're talking about, a larger systemic structure. We're talking about an idea, right? So no, it can't. But the impact of racism can be healed in a therapeutic setting. Right? We can break through issues of imposter syndrome. We can break through issues of internalized racial aggression. We can break through issues of unhealthy boundaries. We can break through issues of intergenerational trauma. So it's a lot. Therapy can be very complex, but also can be very simple. It just depends on what the needs are of each individual person.
You make a ton of profound points. And as you close out just now, talking about therapy and racism, it's been interesting. Last couple of years, I've met a few people and have had the pleasure of connecting with a few people who look at different ways to address systemic structures such as racism, at least the behavioral component. And a good friend of mine, Jeanette Marais, season 2, Chopping Block, episode 1, she talked about, she does work in kindness. And she talks about how the answer to a lot of this is kindness and or empathy. And if I can sort of MLK it and
Yep.
see you for the content of your character. Not just that though, right? Because we recognize these systems exist, and I want you to see me for my blackness above pretty much most things.
Yep.
But if in doing that, I can also see that you're kind with it, then I can move beyond these elements of power and privilege that prevent me from connecting with you at really the humanistic level. And you talked about healing, and earlier on you said, if we get to that later, I want you to double back on that a little bit more. You had some powerful words, Jay, in this bio of yours that I found, right? Where you sort of are positioning to the reader, or ideally the potential client. You ask this question, you ask, do you find yourself saying internally that this shouldn't hurt anymore? And that was heavy. I was like, oh no. Now I know Jay Carey, and I know that he means that question sincerely.
Oh, yeah.
And it reminded me of a quote I first heard from my guy, Dr. Eric House, who was chopping block last season, New Mexico State University.
Mm-hmm.
He said, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah, they do.
Hurt people hurt people. And I've heard that a couple of times since, but I hadn't heard it before then. Jay, is that true? And what does that mean to you? And does it apply to this question of that you ask these clients in your particular bio?
Yeah. So loaded there. And I love all of this. Because starting with your most recent mention around hurt people, I think that it's absolutely true. I also think that there are occasions, depending on the response, where hurt people can heal people. Depending on the response and how we respond to the hurt, right? So it's like, it is true that if left unchecked, painful emotions are going to manifest and attract more pain. No question.
Is that misery needs company, or is that an unfair?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's like basic law of attraction. If this is the frequency that I'm on, as I feel the frequency, I'm going to offer it to other people.
Mm-hmm. Really. You get back what you put out. I love saying that. Yes.
And if I was to quote Les Brown, we don't get in life what we want. We get what we are. Right. And
okay.
So
all right.
And that's why, back to the point around kindness, which was wonderful. And I did catch a sneak peek of that podcast. I need to watch the whole thing now. Speaking to kindness, similar idea, the similar function happens. As we feel kindness, we get to share that with people. As we demonstrate and show up in circles with kindness, we get to feel some of that ourselves. Mm-hmm. So sometimes kindness takes a degree of practice. And as we practice kindness in other circles, we get to feel some too. If I'm loving toward my brother Sherrod, I get to feel some of that love as it comes out of me. Right.
That's
as
right.
I'm so grateful for you and the things that you've been able to do with your experience, I've been able to win from your wins because I feel that gratitude for you winning. Right. So,
gotcha.
And
yes.
Not for nothing, in the therapy space, we get to practice kindness. We get to learn kindness in a therapy space because, again, it's a safe space. It allows us to put our guard down, right. And it also allows us to learn about empathy. It teaches ways to learn about self-compassion first. And then once we are compassionate towards self, we can love better when we learn how to love ourselves.
Indeed.
We can offer better when we learn how to treat ourselves like someone we love. So what does that look like for us to treat ourselves like someone we love? Because oftentimes, as you know, in terms of these systems, people that are clear and openly, angry or racist or a number of these isms, right, played out, manifested, are often rooted in insecurity, are often rooted in the lack of wholeness within oneself.
True.
And so that then becomes a projection, and I'm projecting my anger onto you because I know there's a deficit inside of me, and I've been socialized, to your earlier point, in a design that's already flawed. But I don't know it. And so I'm so accustomed to this level of privilege that all of a sudden equity then feels like oppression, right? So it's like back to the design.
I like that.
And so,
yes. Wow.
And so, back to my question in that bio that I wrote around, suffering. When I hear that question around, this shouldn't hurt anymore, right? Pain is something we're all going to experience. It comes, it goes, it's fleeting. It's supposed to be. Suffering is prolonged. Suffering is sustained. Suffering is ongoing, and it's ever present.
It's the profane in Buddhism. It's the antagonist. So interesting.
Exactly. And so I'm thinking of Lehman Hua, right? Color of Fear.
Oh, yeah. Right? Yeah.
The solution to the pain is in the pain. So,
right.
Right. When we go through sometimes the first time through the wall, we're going to get bloody. And so if we want to get on the other side of that wall, sometimes we have to do the work. And so if we confront suffering rather than avoiding it or compartmentalizing it or ignoring it or telling ourselves we're okay or trying to drink it away or smoke it away or whatever it is away, if we can confront it and face it and name it and acknowledge what's behind it, then we can heal. That's what therapy is intended to be for.
It's like, the first step of addressing any problem or addiction is naming it, right? Acknowledging that it's there first and foremost. Yeah. And then let's move forward. And I love how you applied that to the work of therapy. And, everything I came into this conversation knowing therapy, not fully understanding it. I have a much better grasp on it now. My wife's a proponent of therapy. The kids in my house are proponents of therapy. I'm a proponent of it. I had never experienced a session myself. And so hopefully anybody else out there who was like, tell me a little bit more about this. I think what you're dropping here today, Jay, is some serious, serious gems, man. And I'm grateful. I got just a couple more questions, brother, and I'm going to send you back, give you your day back, man. Let you do your thing. I appreciate you being here with me. Personally, and for other folks who might identify as such, talk to me about being a dad, man, being a Black dad. Talk about fatherhood. What concerns you? And center it on race for me. What concerns you with little Jay, right? Yeah. JoJo, Jade is floating around. Yeah. What concerns you? What brings you joy? What do you love the most? As you know, I'm a newish dad, 2 years, and I have my own concerns about raising a Black boy. I'm here in Tucson, raising a Black boy. Yeah. Talk to us about fatherhood, man, being a Black dad and all of that good stuff.
So being a dad, as you know, I would have to say it's the most beautiful experience I've ever had.
Oh man, indeed.
Right. One. Number two, it's interesting when you reference kind of centering it around race, especially related to kind of the challenges or some things that I may be worried about. The reason why I say that is because more than anything else in life, I am more worried about racism with my children than anything else.
Yes.
And for example, case in point, during the pandemic, BLM got really, really, really loud, really big, profound movement, no question, very, very painful experience for a number of us. Particularly for Black and brown folks, I would have to say it was more like a very, very sad reunion.
Right.
It wasn't new. And so for a number of folks, I think, I saw on social media time and time again how there was this new profound kind of uncovering and discovering that I also knew amongst my people that they were very familiar with it already.
Oh, yeah.
And so, unfortunately, I was also quite familiar with it. And colorism is real, by the way. I am light-skinned. I acknowledge that. And I know that treatment changes based on skin tone, for sure. I've seen that time and time again personally, and I know it just academic. I just know it's true. And so, quick story. So, during the pandemic, it's 2020, and, the protests are heavy. I haven't yet taken my son to one of the protests. My daughter was involved in them in Albany. My niece was involved in them in Albany. I hadn't yet been outside like that. I mean, not heavy. And because it was still relatively early on. And because I had a young kid and it was still pandemic, and my youngest had, pulmonary issues, I didn't engage myself much in crowds early on. But one day, we're driving home and we're driving past a protest, and there is a woman walking down the street, a white woman with a very large street sign that says, "Stop killing Black people." My son's 9 years old, and he looks through the back window and he reads the sign and he says, "Dad, that sign didn't just say stop killing Black people, did it?" And it was like there was this pause in my mind. I was like, "No." Honestly, the first reaction was, "I'm not ready."
Right.
I'm not ready for him to have an encounter.
No.
Because we want to protect our kids. So it's never going to be comfortable. It's always important when it happens, but it's not something that we don't want to rush the reality of racism,
Yes. Right.
So he read the sign, paused. I had to think of how I was going to collect my words. His mother looked at me and I said, "Jay, so here's the deal." I said, "As you know, there are a lot of good people in this world. And there's also a lot of people that are lost. There's a lot of people that are hurt. There's a lot of people that are broken. And sometimes that causes them to look like really bad people. And I'm not sure if there's bad people or not yet, but I know there's a lot of broken ones." And I said, most recently, there was an incident, that happened where a Black man was hurt really, really bad. And it was recorded, and people saw it. And in response to that, there's a number of people that choose not to tolerate that. And so now there is a movement where people are starting to get up and get out and have these discussions. I'm guessing that by probably my third or fourth word in that entire statement, he already melted down. He couldn't even hear me. Tears are flowing. He's hysterical, quiet, hysterically crying. I'm, trying to hold in emotions right now.
Right.
And so we then had to have a larger conversation, and it was continual. And then, we manifested that into a place of agency. And so we made signs. He created his own sign with a picture. I made my sign. We went out to some protests and we did some work. Right.
Nice.
And so it was a cool opportunity for him to exercise agency. But the pain that he had to experience, it's exceptional. I can't even explain what it did to me as a dad. So if I was afraid or had a concern, it would be racism over anything. Yep. Because it's so systemic and it's so rooted, and there are so many broken people out in the world still, that I'm afraid. I'm afraid. I still have issues, around, kind of, the way in which, policing emerged historically, and how the structures that continue to manifest some really, really dangerous narrative. So, and I also, I'm not trying to feel too radical or extreme, but the reality is, the narrative of hate, the narrative of discrimination and police brutality, it's an extreme narrative. I don't know how else to say it. And so, as a dad, as a Black dad raising Black kids, the way in which they show up in the world is a constant concern for me, not in terms of how they're showing up, but in terms of how they're being received.
Yes.
It's scary. It's terrifying.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And super profound as always, and I'm both sorry that little Jay had to go through that. And also, what other word I want to use? Also appreciative, maybe, that though it happened early enough that he was able to understand it, so that he now has the tools necessary to be able to understand what's happening next. And you handle that in ways I don't know if I know anybody else who could have done it that way, including myself. So that was, you are the standard bearer, man, that working on the fly in that way. And I mean, that is, and life is not going to provide you with a strategic plan. A lot of times it's, oh, here you go. Let's figure this out.
Figure it out.
And you got the youngins that are looking for you to do so. Jay, man, look, this is my last question I want to throw to you. I want you to have the opportunity to talk about those who influenced you. But I also have to say, man, you've always been a mentor to me, as I said in the very beginning. Mentor, friend, brother, the whole nine. And I tell people this in side conversations, but I always said that you taught me sort of how to talk, how to navigate predominantly white spaces. You know, I remember the cafeteria scenario. I feel like we've talked about this before where, you know, you, me, and a few others were chopping it up, code switching, yes, living our life. And a white guy came by, tapped you, and you were like, hey, and, you know, engaged the convo. And, you know, I watched it, and you learn that a lot of this is somewhat of a game to an extent. Unfortunately, I remember us having the Men of Color initiatives or the meetings, and I remember we were sitting there. I'll never forget it, man. We were sitting there talking about experiences with police and how we are expected to behave and how we have to behave. And that's when we first started talking about sort of blackness and the game as a life skill, not as a topic of conversation. And I remember a white dude walked in, and the language shifted from these white cops who were racist to, you know, European men who have oppressive tendencies. Like we weren't willing to name it. We weren't comfortable because of the presence of one white face. And sort of you taught me how to remain true to yourself while still being in these spaces, not losing who you are. And I remember your speech at graduation. For those who don't know, Carey was a commencement speaker, one of those 2 master's degrees years. And that motivated me, man, I said, I want to do that. Here's Jay. There's a lot of things. I'm going to take the soapbox for a moment. I know this is Jay's show, but I want to make sure he gets his respect and his due. You know, I remember being in the stands and watching Jay, who I had known for going on a year at this point. I think this was your master's of social work here. Yeah. And, you gave this speech that was awesome by definition. It was huge. It was like jaw dropping. And I'm like, here's this dude who I admire, who's a brother, who's not afraid to be himself, who, you know, cats know Jay. They know Jay. They know the man. He's not out here playing games for people, but he's also like the commencement speaker. I just saw so much power and so much influence in that I was like, I want that. And I watched how you moved ever since then. I was fortunate enough to be that guy the next year for the commencement speak. No, I was just watching, man. And I was like, this guy, Jay, is it. I remember seeing you show up one day to, this is the funniest one for me. You showed up to it was a larger, meeting for the campus leaders or something like that. Everybody's there in their business gear, and you show up with a Kango hat, T-shirt, some blue jeans, and some Timbs. Yeah. At this formal meeting, I'm like, that's when you know you made it, man. When you can show up that and still command the same kind of respect that would be expected if you were in a certain tie. But the last thing I want to name is that the one thing you showed me more than anybody else, any other man in my life, is you showed me how to be vulnerable as a man, right? And there's no surprise that we're talking about therapy and such in the conversation. And like I've heard you say multiple times to older men, love you, say it to me all the time. You know, showing love to you was like a competition. Who can get the last one in? You know what I mean? So you're always uplifting somebody. And then the way that you treat your kids. And, you know, I remember being at your house one day and your son had to, I feel like little Jay had to brush his teeth. And you were like, you know, time to brush your teeth. And he's like, oh, I want to walk off. And you called him back like, hey, he came back. You're like, I love you. And that was it. His entire night shifted. He wasn't upset about brushing teeth anymore. He went and was looking forward to brush his teeth. But it's those little things that I never got, but we never really said that in my house or anything like that, that really I translate into my own parenting, into my own relationships with Black men and with men in general, and how to be vulnerable and how to be open about that. So I wanted to show you love, but also pass it back to you and ask you. Yep. You mentioned Lee earlier, but who are some of your inspirations, some of your motivations, some of the folks who you served as mentors for you coming up or throughout your journey that maybe you might want to shout out and can speak to the man you are today?
Well, so I appreciate that so much, and we all reflect each other's light. I'd have to. I'm not. I'm not going to go anywhere until I leave without giving you your love right back.
Oh no, come on, man. That's not what this is about here.
Offered a speech, and I wrote it and read it and memorized it and still read it and read it. I mean, I must have read that speech 500 times. I spent an hour every single night for a month in the garage. What you did perfected the orator experience. You perfected public speaking. So like whatever I offered to you, thank you for that. And in truth, I definitely don't remember it that way.
All of it.
But I have to say that what you did the year after put mine not even to shame, because there's no comparative at all. I was so honored for you to go that next year and bring what I was able to do to a level that I could never even imagine. I've never done a speech without a script, never in my life. And not even that, the way in which you captured the audience, you started off from a place of recognition. You played gratitude. You pulled your family into the experience. You also spoke truth to power and spoke to some very, very in-depth kind of, history lessons through the lens of your family story. And it was so beautiful. It was so transcendent. I was like, stay on stage, never seen this before. I wanted to run up on stage and drop the mic for you. I was like, yeah, that's it. We shouldn't even be calling names of graduates anymore. That's it. So you riffed in. It's also interesting to hear that. I love, what you referenced around, us and vulnerability, but then also having a language around certain things. You're one of the most articulate people that I've ever met in my life. And I learned from you every single time that we meet, so much so that I would go on a limb and say, that's why it's taken me so long to get on the job. Was because I want to go on record saying I was literally intimidated because I'm so humbled by your greatness. And I'm so honored just to know you as a human. It literally makes my moment every time I hear anything Sherrod Robbins. It's like, yes. And in truth, to be completely honest, if you would have asked me directly, I wouldn't have said no to you. I was afraid to say yes. But if you would have been like, yo, Jay, I need you on this, I would have been like, all right, fine. And I would have. So now, separate to that, first and foremost, I have to give praise to my father, Frank Anastasio. Raised me from nothing into something. Mind of an engineer, heart of a warrior, strongest man I've ever met. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have made it anywhere. So giving him flowers. He's 76 years old, and I'm going to make sure that I send this to him anyway, just to give a shout out. So thank you for that.
Indeed.
Like you mentioned, Dr. Libra-Swa, absolutely. My big brother, Sean Newton, absolutely.
Oh, yes. Who I got to get on Sean if you're listening.
Right.
I'm coming for you soon on this too.
Good. Because he is a trendsetter, and without Sean paving his way, I wouldn't have been able to run behind him, because he's able to created a pathway for me that I just wouldn't have had, straight up.
Right. Yes.
The whole Lane family, I got to shout out.
All of them, man. All 30,000.
Yeah. And I have to say, like, in terms of big brother, father figure, David Jordan Lane, also raised me on the street. And he protected me, and he looked out for me, and he pulled me into the Lane family in really, really beautiful ways. I also would not be where I am. Shout out to Mama Lane, Mama Donna Lane.
Indeed.
I would not be who I am without Mama Lane. I would not be who I am without David Jordan Lane, Donnell and Damien, my brothers forever. Freddie, everybody, Donna, Delilah, Carlotta, everybody. So shout out to
all 30,000, like I said.
Right. Right. So man, my big brother Ree, I mean, and I'm calling on men in particular, just kind of keeping with the theme and the context, but also so many beautiful women in my life as well. My big sister definitely helped pave the way.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, my mom's is my guardian angel on earth, so I've been super blessed. And this has been a journey, and I still feel like we're at the beginning of it,
right.
So.
Yes.
Moving forward, if there's anything you ever need from me, please don't hesitate to just ask, and I got you.
My man.
And ask directly, because if you make it gentle, I might default my imposter syndrome and say no. But
well,
I'm one phone call away. You call me and I'm coming. It's going to take me a while to drive out there, but I'm on my way. So,
hey, listen, man, you made it out to the wedding a couple of years back, which we weren't sure was going to happen because you just had your daughter, but you had every reason not to come. You made it to that. You were at my dissertation defense while on vacation.
Yes.
Look, man, you don't got to convince me. Just know that whenever we're back in Boston, we might be there next summer, next spring. You know, the Carey household is the first stop we do every year.
Doors already open. Doors already
appreciate
open.
You.
Yeah, you already know.
Let you go, Jay. Where can people find you, man? Social media handles, websites, emails, anything that makes sense.
So, good question. So, my Instagram, I just learned, I believe, is a handle. That's the @address, right?
That's right.
Yo, technology's not my thing, as you can see.
Handle.
I think it's Tony Humble 360 is my Instagram address, aka handle. Yes, I'm getting
handle.
My you say email?
If you want anywhere people can reach you, that's all.
Anywhere people can reach me. So I'm on Psychology Today. Okay, it's just Jay Carey. I'm based out of Swampscott, Massachusetts. So if you put in Jay Carey, Massachusetts, I'm going to come up. PsychologyToday.com. I'm also on InnoPsych. INNOPSYCH.com, I believe it is. InnoPsych is a therapy platform for Black and Brown therapists. Probably good for people to know anyway. InnoPsych, just the same, I'm on that as well. So Jay Carey, Massachusetts, I'll pop up. And of course, if that's not enough, people could find me if they reach out to the legendary Dr. Sherrod Robbins. I can be found. Right now, things are extraordinarily busy, but I will absolutely entertain any love or any resourcing that I can offer for people. So
I love it, man.
Yo, brother Jay, listen, man.
Thank you, bro.
You know what I'm saying? The whole intent today was to be as informal as possible because you're my guy, but also the topic was critically important, and it can't be had eloquently or effectively with any real structure. So I appreciate you flowing with me, appreciate your vulnerability, for you teaching me, schooling me, taking me in many ways from the young cat who came from, who entered in the 3X white tee with the Jabot jeans, and left with that, but also an understanding of how this game works. You know what I'm saying? So, Jay, I appreciate you, baby.
My job was to hold you up and get out the way. And and if I even had a role at all, and that's what I've done. I've been able to get out of your way and stay in your corner. So you always know that you got a backup if you need it. You know what I'm saying? So always love, my best always to you and the family, and anything I can ever do, you let me know. Likewise, baby. And for y'all listening, thank you all so much. My man, Jay Carey, Dr. Sherrod Robbins, with the chopping block at visceralchange.org.